Father Turbo up there a lot longer, but
If you press it quickly, you really need to
have
have
all of you. He has trampled upon death, and to those in the tombs he has granted life. Father, do you know it in Serbian? Want to chant that in Serbian? No. Okay. Christos înviat în morți, cu moartea premoarte călcând, și celor din mormânturi viață dăruindu-le. Okay, 2 times is enough. Okay, so glory to the Father, and to the Son, and to the Holy Spirit, both now and ever, and unto the ages of ages. Amen. Lord have mercy, Lord have mercy, Lord have mercy. Father, bless. Okay, thank you, everybody. So, really, I'm in a kind of a strange situation because I've been so busy with my parish and with my other job that probably most of you know what's happening better than I do, right? So I can't recall the talk, what the talk is going to be about right now. So I'm just going to hand it over to Father Turbo. I do know there's going to be a question and answer session afterwards, so you can think about the question and answers that you're going to want to ask or talk about. I'm very excited to see everybody here, and I think we're going to all have a beneficial weekend and evening. So I very much appreciate it. And you know, we can always be praying for Father, for each other while this is going on. So I encourage you to listen with your heart, not just with your mind, not just for information, but for a spiritual renewal, for a spiritual connection to our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ. And may your listening and your questioning and your searching be blessed. Amen.
Thank you.
Am I live now? Okay. Great. Christ is risen. So if we could get the PowerPoint on. And forgive me, Father, I'm going to go off script just a little bit because I know there's going to be...
It'll turn the pages.
Oh, perfect.
If you head down. And it's got a laser pointer if you want to.
The wand. Great, thank you. I know there's going to be a Q&A session, but might want to hit the lights actually. Yeah, good. I know there's going to be a Q&A session, but I do want to encourage if there's questions, because I'm not the most succinct guy. You know, I'm all over the place sometimes. And also too, as I'm going forward, if there's some things that just aren't making sense, please don't hesitate to kind of interrupt me, raise your hand and ask the question. And the reason why I like that, we can still have Q&A afterwards, but the reason why I like that is because during the process of me sharing with you some really valuable insights might come up. Sometimes we forget them, we don't write them down. But sometimes those insights, which seem like a kind of hijacking of the conversation, are actually where the conversation needs to go. And so those of you who are familiar with like the real path or anything like that, just know I like dialogue anyways. And so to be really honest with you, if I could, I would just sit here and talk with you guys for both sessions, whatever. But I'll give a talk, and hopefully it will facilitate us, being together and seeing what God has, okay? So tonight, this first talk is speaking about emotions. Let's see here. The power and proper role of emotions in the life of an Orthodox Christian. So the title of Let Them Serve You, and hopefully it'll become pretty evident why that title is there, but let me just give you a little background of why I think it's necessary and why I want to talk about this. The reality is that for a lot of people who are either A, coming into the church, or B, kind of coming of age, so even if you were raised in the church, you've been in the church forever, as you ascend into maturity and you begin to have your own families, begin to have your own businesses, you begin to become leaders in society, leaders of your communities, you are instinctively going to have a desire to want to, yes, of course, go deeper in the church, but more importantly, have a better understanding of how to get along with people. Now, that may sound boring to you, but I'm going to tell you something. If you don't know how to get along with your wife or your husband or your kids, if you don't know how to get along with people, you can't really get along with God. You can't do it. And so one of the biggest hurdles to that is people, especially in our generation and younger generations, have problems with knowing how to not just deal with emotions, but understanding the place of emotions in the life of a Christian. And a lot of this is because of pop psychology informs the way that we view life, and unfortunately the way we view faith and spirituality more than the Father's does. So a lot of what we think about emotions and things like that aren't really rooted in the tradition of the church, but more rooted in, again, what somebody who is not in communion with God would say on those things. And all of it matters because, there's no point in you talking about anything in the Philokalia. There's no point in you talking about Gregoriopalamos. There's no point in you talking about really any of the deep things in the church if you can't even have some of the basic fundamentals of managing your emotions. If this makes sense, right? So in some ways, understand tonight is kind of me trying to introduce something to you, kind of like an on-ramp. This is an on-ramp to go deeper into your spiritual life. Right? Because again, if you don't know how to have relationships with other people, then you don't have a spiritual life. If you don't know how to handle trials and temptations, that's what the spiritual life is all about. Okay? So these three things here, we're going to look at why is the question of emotions important to Orthodox Christians. We're going to look at what are emotions really, and how are we to reconcile the contemporary definition with our patristic definition, our patristic tradition, and how can our tradition help us understand our emotions, their impact on us, and how to put them in their proper place. So I'm going to do that, first of all, by defining some terms. And the terms aren't going to necessarily be something that's going to be universally applicable, but I'm going to do that just for the point of this conversation to get some things across to you guys. And then we're going to talk about the need to translate the faith, right? And this is going to be an important part because I think that my big thing is if you're talking about, let's say, again, St. Gregoriopalamos and the essence and energies discussion. That isn't something that should just be for quote-unquote academic theologians. It shouldn't be something that's just for quote-unquote monastics. That matters for you. You understanding what St. Gregoriopalamos is talking about matters for you at your job. I don't know what the story here is, but in Kansas City, it's called the Quick Trip. Like the Quick Trip is our local convenience store. So it's like that matters whether you're at the Quick Trip at your job or whether you're giving a lecture at your parish, right? All of our theology matters. The big problem is it's oftentimes only or exclusively couched in terms that are beyond our ability to kind of approach it. So what I'm going to hope to do is to define some things so that it will help us to get to deep places in ways that really impact our lives, right? I don't want it to just be like, oh, I know something kind of that sounds brainy. That doesn't help you. It actually hurts you, right? And then the last part is getting into application, okay? Let me read you this quote from Metropolitan Fleuret. He says, unfortunately, in many good Orthodox Christian families, life is arranged in such a way that the parents consciously guard their children from contact with human need, sorrow, heavy difficulties, and trials. Such an excessive protection of children from sober reality brings only negative results. Children who have grown up under greenhouse conditions, separated from life, grow up soft, spoiled, and not well adjusted for life. Often thick-skinned egoists, accustomed only to demanding and receiving, and not knowing how to yield, to serve, or to be useful to others. Life can break such people cruelly, and sometimes punishes them unbearably, often from their early school years. It is necessary, therefore, for those who love their children to temper them. Above all, there must always be one definite Orthodox Christian aim set before both parents and children. That children, while growing and developing physically, must also grow and develop spiritually, that they may become better, kinder, more pious, and more sympathetic. Unfortunately, that quote is painfully true. It's painfully true. I can just tell you, not even being a priest, but just being, a Gen Xer and having my own kids and just seeing it's like, we see this type of behavior is just rampant with a lot of just human beings in general. Just human beings in general have a tendency to be just self-centered and selfish, but the conditions in which people are growing up over these last few decades has fomented this. It's accelerated it. It's caused it to be frank, the expected outcome, right? It's one of those things where this softness that he's talking about, growing up soft, spoiled, not well adjusted. I was reading Saint Sophrony, and he was talking about prostrations, and he was saying that prostrations in prayer are necessary. They're necessary not only for the humbling of the body, but he says, and he was talking about in this context of Great Lent, he said, but also too for the monastic who has left off his obediences during Holy Week and to still have the necessary movement of the body, right? Because he says, when the body is not, he says everything is meant towards movement. Everything. And so when the human body ceases to move, it becomes unhealthy. And I will tell you from personal experience, my knee and the damage from my knee and my tendon is terrible. I had to get a replacement. But what kept me from serving for so long was actually being bedridden. Because that being bedridden for so long caused my muscles to atrophy and my glutes and my hamstrings, right? And so even though I had surgery, I wasn't able to serve and function as quick as I wanted to because my body had atrophied from not moving. So I'm telling you from personal experience, that's a real thing. You stop moving, it only takes a matter of a few days before you have, atrophying of your muscles. So what Saint Sophrony is saying is true. But it also applies not just to the body. It applies to the heart, right? When our heart isn't exercised properly, right, it's not able to bring us to this place where we can deal with things, like interactions with people without losing our minds, right? And so this condition in which a lot of children find themselves where parents with good intentions shelter their children from the necessary experiences that will help them become actually better human beings. Right? So there's a real art to this. There's a real art to being able to allow just enough pain so that the human being can be just that, a human being. So when that doesn't happen, then that is where the development of a child gets stuck. And I'm not going to bore you with a bunch of child psychology, and I'm going to try to keep things, really simple, but just understand that there's a place around the age between 3 and 7 where a child begins to become aware of the world outside of themselves. And if a child's development there is hindered, then that's where they become very, let's say, difficult, right? They become completely egocentric, and we're all used to 3-year-olds and even 5-year-olds throwing tantrums. But the reason why you see 8-year-olds, 9-year-olds, 11-year-olds, 12-year-olds throwing tantrums is because that movement out of that I am the center of the world and there's others was hindered somehow or dampened. So their ability to interact with their emotions in the right way is hindered, okay? This is a quote from Father Stephen Freeman. Excuse me. He says, "We live in a culture of strong feelings. How we feel about something is generally taken to mean what I believe. This is not all the case." Right? That right there is everything. How I feel, right, is to be taken of what I believe. If you understand what he's saying right there, we can almost just stop the presentation and go home, okay? This is not all the case. Most people have a set of feelings or sentiments that largely serve the purpose of supporting the story that they tell themselves about who they are. Quote, "I am a person who cares about animals," end quote. It is not actually pierced through the level of describing character. It would be more accurate to say, I am the kind of person who's defined by a set of feelings. For the feelings themselves, our sentiments, quite often do not rise to the level of action, nor constitute a way of living. The actual character of a person would be best observed by watching them for a few weeks and studying their actions, not listening to their words. How we feel and how we live are frequently not the same thing at all. Sentiment is a function of the passions, and rather shallow passions at that. It is a disposition towards pleasure, a sentiment that says, I think human suffering is terrible, quote. It is generally a sentiment that will avoid confronting the nature of suffering in its true depths. If you're decently middle class, you can afford to avoid encounters with many forms of suffering. You can filter your friend list in a manner to see and hear what you find pleasant and agreeable. Now, one of the reasons why I'm framing things in a certain way too is because there's a piece of data here that I maybe should have put in, but I didn't. But just trust me when I tell you that when you look at if you look at the aggregate of Orthodox Christians on the socioeconomic level, it's generally Orthodox Christians or those who are associated with the church tend to be middle to upper middle class, okay, which is great. It's wonderful. But the reason why I'm bringing that in in kind of a problematic context is that this reveals a couple things to us. First of all, and a lot of people might have this experience where people's experience of being raised in the church isn't really about learning how to be a human being, but rather how to produce. So in other words, it's good we go to church on Sunday. It's good you do these things in here. But outside of Sunday, your everyday experience and the formation that a lot of parents give their children, unfortunately, is about your whole reality should be about what you're going to do to make money and how people are going to see you in regards of your class, your occupation. So I'm not saying that it's wrong to make money, and it's not wrong to aspire to be respected. That's not the problem. The problem is that when you say that to a child in the context of the church, almost to the detriment of them having to learn the things that give someone the ability to have, let's say, empathy, right? When you teach someone that, people who suffer or people who have a hard time or people who are poor, all these things, they're like that kind of because they deserve it. they're either, not as smart as we are, whatever the thing is, then you're teaching Christians to not have a mindset that will allow them to be the body of Christ. You understand what I'm saying to you? The whole purpose of us being in the Orthodox Church is that we manifest Christ in this world. Does that mean that everyone needs to be in sackcloth and ash and eating beans and rice every day? No. But what it does mean is that we have to understand that the teachings of Christ, it's up to us to bring these things into the world, right? And if someone's life is geared in such a way that is at best secondary, if never brought up, but what's always brought up is make as much money as you can, make sure that people see you always only in the best light, then what's going to happen is that their ability to not only be empathetic to people who are maybe struggling, but more importantly, their response to the life of the church and the teachings of Christ are going to be retarded. They're going to think like, oh, that's kind of nice, I did that on Sunday, but I'll receive communion, I'll pray, but the rest of the week, someone looks at me cross, I'm going to yell at them. My wife or my husband says something to me I don't like, I'm going to let him have it. Eye for an eye. And we're not supposed to live that way. And if we always live that way, then the grace of God isn't in the world. Because not everybody's supposed to be a priest, not everybody's supposed to be a nun, not everybody's supposed to be a church worker. We need doctors, dentists, mechanics, doctors and dentists need to bring Christ in the auto shop and the doctor's office too, right? Think about you're a dentist and your dentist assistant, she's a single mom, her life is kind of rough, whatever, and you're sitting there and she just sees you as this egocentric, narcissistic guy who goes to church on Sunday, but the rest of the week you're working for him and instead he just yells at you and he's just rude and he's cheap. What is her impression of the church going to be? Not very good, right? I know I'm talking about emotions. Let me connect it all for you right now. Hey, dentist Jimmy, you don't need to tell your dentist assistant, Anna, you don't need to preach her the gospel and talk to her about Gregor Palmos. You know what you need to do? You need to be a decent, kind human being to her, right? You learning to not yell at your dentist assistant because your wife made you mad, right? Are you following me? You learning to actually deal with your wife yelling at you and finding a way to find God in that and not taking it to the dentist office is going to have a bigger impact than you might realize. But if you think it's just okay to I'm not going to say anything to my wife because I'll be in the doghouse, I'll take it out on Anna, my dentist assistant, you got a real problem. And a lot of people have this mindset because they were never taught that the way that they are interacting with people says not just as much, but more about who they are and their spiritual life than anything else. So let's define some terms. St. Jerome, he says, in talking about his work of translating the Vulgate, he says, "For I myself not only admit, but freely proclaim that in translating from the Greek, I render sense for sense and not word for word, except in the case of the Holy Scriptures, where even the order of words is a mystery." So I'm putting this there because this is an approach I have that I try to take with everything is, there's a time and a place to talk about the nous and the diakonia and the philokalia and all those terms, but I find oftentimes that distracts people. So I'm going to make some things simple here. And the reason why is because there's a formula that I've learned, which is sincerity and simplicity, right? So basically, knowing and believing what you're talking about and being able to express it simply produces two things: accuracy and acceptance. So as we move forward in this, I want to be able to say things in such a way, not to prove to you that I've read books or that I have degrees, which I have both, that's who cares, but rather I want you to go yeah, that makes sense to me. Yeah, I see that in my life, or in the life of my dad, or in the life of my mom, and the life of my friends. I see that. And when you have that sense of, yeah, that makes sense to me, you'll be able to accept it. Because without that acceptance, it's just head knowledge, which just, we all have enough head knowledge. It doesn't really do much for us, okay? So, just laying out a large framework, which you all know, but I just want us to all be on the same page, right? The fall was a traumatic event. Let's just frame the fall in this sense, right? And I know trauma can be used and overused, but just follow me on this. The fall was a traumatic event that was induced by idolatry, okay? And it led to division and ultimately death. This cycle is now repeated in the life of every human being. Young people find themselves in the world, which is the garden, right? And are tempted to seek fulfillment outside of God and His timing, right? And this cycle results in these things, right? Person against God, that's a division, right? Person against creation, it's another division. Nation against nation, right? Man against woman, but more importantly here, man against himself. Man is divided within himself. And if you understand getting to the core of orthodoxy, and what orthodoxy does is orthodoxy is about integration. It's about the person being made whole again, right? To where our heads and our hearts aren't going like this all the time, okay? So that aspect here, that fragmentation, it's important. And so ordering the body, ordering the spirit, ordering the soul is what we're after when we're practicing our faith. This is a picture of Tsar Lazar. Do you guys know who Tsar Lazar is? Serbia, Tsar Lazar. Okay, so Tsar Lazar was a king in Serbia, and he was, at this time, politically, historically, Serbia was this kind of like Helm's Deep for the rest of the Orthodox world, right? As the Turks were coming in, it was kind of up to Serbia to defend against the orcs. Are you following me? Okay. So Tsar Lazar had a vision before he went to battle, and basically he was asked by an angel of the Lord, what do you want? Do you want an earthly kingdom or a heavenly kingdom? Tsar Lazar picked the heavenly kingdom. Okay. So he goes out to battle, and this is all historical, by the way. So he goes out to battle, this portion especially, and the Serbian army rises up early. They're all communed, they all receive communion, and they go to battle against the Turks, okay? Well, they're slaughtered. They're absolutely slaughtered. And Lazar was captured, and he was brought to the tent of the Sultan, and he was beheaded, but in this epic poem, which was written by Saint Nikolai Veromovich, he's wondering, what happened? Why did we get slaughtered? I chose the heavenly kingdom. And so the angel says to him, yes, you chose the heavenly kingdom. And so since you chose the heavenly kingdom, you have to go the way of the heavenly king, which is the cross, right? You losing is how you actually win. So this, no one likes to hear that, but it's the gospel. It's the gospel, right? And so I have this here because this is from the epic poem, The Mystical Meaning of Kosovo. Without this basic comprehension and distinction, how can one comprehend what is happening to him in the world? And how can the destiny of a people and all that happens to a people be understood? Without this basic comprehension and distinction, O most valiant knight of this day, no one among mortals can grasp what is happening today on this field of battle. So the thing I'm saying is, do you understand what the battle is that you're dealing with, right? Because the use of our faculties, how we interact with people, it is a battle. And this is just as much about spiritual warfare as it is about anything else. Because spiritual warfare isn't necessarily about dealing with tyrannical governments or dealing with, demon-possessed people jumping through windows and things like that. It really has everything to do with the slow drip of a husband just not embracing the cross, not knowing how to engage with his wife and his children, and then that divide grows over time. And that divide growing over time is just like I gave that example. This is really where the battle is fought, because you can't have a church without healthy members. Understand what I'm saying to you. Things that happen on a big scale, changes in liturgical practices, changes in doctrine, God forbid even changes in dogma, they can only happen to a church if the church has been weakened on the low level of the body. If families don't know how to find Christ in the family, if they don't know how to engage with each other, then they're going to be susceptible to anything, right? This is really where it's at. So there's these three parts of men. Everyone probably understands this, and fathers have different ways of speaking about this. They're never contradictory, but they're always complementary, right? Emphasizing one thing over the other. But basically, you're dealing with the body, the soul, and the spirit. And understanding that the body obviously is the point in which we connect with the material world, but the soul is man's inward part, and the soul is what deals with what we would call the psychological realm, right? Our thoughts and our feelings, right? And that's where it's composed of like emotions and will. And the spirit is the essence of man, and it's the thing given to us by God, okay? And it's that hidden part of man. St. Justin Martyr, he says, the soul is not man, but is called man's soul. In the same way, the body is not called a man, but man's body. Though in himself, man is neither of these. The combination of the two is called man. God called man to life and resurrection, and he did not call a part, but the whole, which is the soul and the body. If you think that, people find this all the time, someone invests all their time to work out and be healthy with their body. But if you are great, you're muscular, you can run a marathon, but you're a terrible person, who cares? Who cares? But also let me say this other quote to you from Sophrony. He was talking about excessive asceticism. And people who are experienced will know the truth of what I'm about to say. You can weigh yourself down with excessive asceticism so much that you can't pray anymore. People have a misunderstanding. They think that, monastics are just in there and they're like, Lent comes and they're just eating, the dust of crumbs and squeezing out water, out of the washcloth, and that's how they're living. It's like, some of the hermits maybe, but it's like I tell my nuns, like, okay, what are we doing for, clean week, right? And I always tell them, you need to eat enough to pray. I say, you need to eat enough to fast. What do you mean, eat enough to fast? Because of the weakness of our time, the person who's like, I'm just not going to eat anything at all, ever, right? And I'm going to fast all day and all night. That person generally, because of the weakness of our generation, ends up just pigging out, right? Or even worse, they end up becoming such, like St. John Chrysostom says, they may not have eaten the meal in front of them, but they've devoured their brother and sister because they're so hangry that by the end of the night after Compline, Sister Elizabeth, says something, and then, Sister Euphemia will be like, oh, I can't stand her, like those things, right? Those things are actually surprisingly dealt in a very practical way, right? So all of this is practical, but my main point is it's the same thing with the soul. If you don't address your emotions and these things like that, you could be reading books and you can be thinking you're this and that, but again, if you don't learn just the basics of what it means to be kind, right? And here's the thing, not in a vainglorious way, because we can all be kind when people are looking at us. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about it's the end of the day. no one else is looking. It's just you and like your friend or you and your wife or you and your kids. And it's just like, you don't have any mind at all to have some kindness and some mercy, right? You can pray, quote unquote, and you can read all you want. But the thing is if you don't practice this in the level of the soul and the mind and really in the level of emotions, you're not going to get anywhere. It's like the guy who watches UFC and he just binges watches UFC and he's like, I watch all these matches, and he goes and he's like, I can fight. It's like, you can't fight. You know what I mean? You don't know how to fight, right? Until you actually start practicing and getting in there and learning how to throw a punch and a kick, it's like, you don't know what you're doing, right? So you don't know anything about hezekiah or stillness, any of these things, if you can't learn some basic general kindness, politeness, right? Learning how to not lose your mind because you think someone looked at you the wrong way. Blessed Sarah from Rose, he says, the distinction between soul and spirit does not mean that these are separate entities within human nature. Rather, the spirit is the higher part of the soul, the lower part of the single invisible part of man, which as a whole is usually called the soul. To the soul, in this sense, belongs those ideas and feelings which are not occupied directly with spiritual life, most of human art, knowledge, and culture, while to the spirit belongs man's strivings towards God through prayer, sacred art, and obedience to God's law. In our own day, the chief ingredient missing from this ideal harmony of human life is something one might call the emotional development of the soul, okay? So this is exactly what I'm talking about. It is something that's not directly spiritual, but that very often hinders spiritual development. It is the state of someone who, while he may think he thirsts for spiritual struggles in an elevated life of prayer, is poorly able to respond to normal human love and friendship. For if a man say, I love God, and hates his brother, he is a liar. For he that loveth not his brother who he hath seen, how can he love God whom he hath not seen? That's 1 John. You know, this idea, some of you who have read The Life of Father Sarah from Rose, but I can even tell you even now, you know, I have friends that are in, let's say, Michael Skeet in Alaska. You know, it's the same thing. Hiram McAndrew will do this. He'll assign people reading Dickens or other things. It's like, yeah, before you want to tackle St. Gregory of Sinai, you might want to read some Dickens. Really. You might want to read, you know, maybe even some Wendell Berry or something to understand how on a natural, basic emotional level to deal with things. And this is really important now in the advent of like orthodoxy is exploding. There's all kinds of jokers who are like on the internet and they talk about stuff, right? And it's easy to just kind of like, yeah, I read this, I heard this, and blah, blah, blah. But again, it's kind of like, you know, the person who wants to start talking about these deep things, but they don't have just the basics. Not only is it, you know, cringy, but it can, but it can be really dangerous. It can be really dangerous because that's how you make a monster. That's how you make a monster. You get this monster of someone who thinks they know something, and the whole while, the thing that they should be dealing with is getting, you know, the cancer that they should have been cutting out is getting bigger and bigger and bigger, and they're not even aware of it. Any questions before I move on? Good. So let's talk about emotions. This is from Dimitri Stenlio. He says, the element of bodily activity or emotionality which grows from the biological side isn't condemnable, and we must not struggle against it because it constitutes the basis of our growth in the spiritual life. St. Maximus is in agreement with the whole of Eastern asceticism, isn't an opponent of biological life. He is not an opponent of biological life, right? Asceticism means, in the spirit of Eastern thought, the restraint and discipline of the biological, not a battle for its extermination. On the contrary, asceticism means the sublimation of this element of bodily affectivity, not its abolition. Christianity doesn't save man from a certain part of his nature, but it saves him as a whole. The power manifested in these natural passions is also tapped to serve man in his ascent to God. Natural passions consume a spiritual character, give an increased ascent to our love for God. So, one of the things here, when like in the forming of the sisters, the nuns, let's say, or in the forming of a catechumen, let's say, or even the forming of my own children, I often tell them, I try to teach them, you cannot trust your emotions. You cannot trust your emotions. You cannot have your emotions be your lodestone, your compass by which you see everything. And I have to work really hard to get them to do it, and it's tough. But I'm not saying that because emotions are bad. I'm saying that because the second part of that is, as I start seeing people make progress, I'll tell them, because what you want to do is you want to get to the point where you can start trusting your emotions more. Because emotions are there for a reason. But because of the fall, remember we were talking about this division? Because of the fall, our emotions aren't functioning in their proper order. That's just fundamental. That's not adding on top external things like your environment, like your culture, right? Like your own physiology. Because things like diabetes, right? A person who's a diabetic is going to have a different kind of struggle with emotional regulation than someone else who isn't. Do you know why? Because blood sugar issues will cause someone to just feel really bad. And so when a diabetic is having a blood sugar issue, right, it isn't necessarily them not having control of their emotions like a spoiled kid is, right? So all these things factor in. So someone who has diabetes, they need to understand things about themselves. That's separate than those who don't. Are you following me? So all those things, if you grew up in a household where your dad yelled all the time, you're going to have to learn things about yourself that someone who didn't, right? You have to take all these things into account. So I look at emotions in this way, right? You got to think of emotions like angels. Just follow me on this. Think of emotions like angels. Because angel means what? Messenger, right? So if you understand that the good angels are messengers of God, they're there to bring a message from God to man. Make sense? But the fallen angels are also messengers. And they're seeking not necessarily to just bring a message from quote unquote the devil, but see, the thing is, and this is what's key, this is why theology matters in this metaphor. Good angels want to bring a message from God for the service of man. Bad angels want to be worshipped. So bad angels, fallen angels, will use messages to facilitate their own worship. Are you guys following me, the difference between these two? Okay, this is going to be key, right? Because God created emotions to serve a purpose. But when emotions are not subjugated in the right way to God, they want to be worshipped. And so this is why I say you cannot trust your emotions, because until you've gone through this place of maturity and really learning how to kind of see through that, your emotions, they're like demons. They want to be worshipped. So the person who's, let's say, someone who's envious, every time they see their friend, because envy actually usually strikes between people you know, first and foremost, right? So the girl who always gets mad when she sees her friend doing better or whatever, she has more friends, whatever, she learns to begin to see and to begin to interact with friends and other people through that lens of self-pity, which is the root, that's the beginning seed of envy. I don't have this, someone else has it. And that feeling of being, feeling sorry for herself, she just trusts it. I have a feeling, well, here's the thing, going back to the beginning, I'm the center of the world, right? My mom and dad, my priest, my brothers and sisters, no one ever told me I wasn't. So I've just lived thinking I'm the center of the world. So whatever I get, whatever I want, I'm going to get it. It doesn't really matter how I get it, because that's all that matters, that I get it. So I'm the center of the world, and if I feel a certain way, it's true. If I'm angry, it's because you've obviously done something wrong. Let me give you another example. You have a woman who gets married. She's never learned to deal with this, and let's say she's married this wonderful guy, and whatever, this wonderful guy, he's just a saint of a man, and she's at the store one day, and she's leaving the store, and then she sees her husband driving somewhere with some woman that she knows from like church or whatever, and then she's like, that's weird, and she just gets this automatic like, Bob's cheating on me, right? And so Bob's cheating on me, and then all of a sudden she's just like, and then without a second thought of it, flame is going through her. She calls up Bob, she's cussing, she goes home, she's breaking dishes. You can imagine the picture, right? Look, church-going people. Well, the whole time she's like, I know you've been cheating on me, Bob, blah, 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 blah. And the whole time Bob's just like, he can't say anything. And the reality is that woman that he picked up had a terrible accident. No one was there to help her. He's the only one who even bothered to help her. He took her to the hospital. You see what I'm saying? But her initial thought of you're cheating on me, and the thought was fueled by this feeling. She's never learned to check it first. She's never learned to say, well, maybe let me at least see what's going on. I can use this over and over and over, right? He'll never see this, whatever. But my son, he got in a fight with his buddy. My 11-year-old son got in a fight with his buddy. Talking about spiritual warfare. Yesterday, while I'm trying to get ready to get here, and it's the same thing, his buddy called him a coward, and instead of him being like, okay, he's just like, what, and just, right? So you can see the value, hopefully, of what I'm trying to say here. But the key thing here is that these emotions, right, they're there for a purpose, but when they're not tamed and they're not brought in subjection to God, they want to be worshiped. They want your attention. So the more that you focus on your emotions without any filter, you're giving them worship, because attention equals worship. Attention equals worship. Yes. When you're in the liturgy, where should your attention be? It should be on God. When you're praying, where should your attention be? It should be on God. Those of you who have a girlfriend, those of you who have a mom, those of you who have a wife, try talking to your wife and not paying attention to her. You know what happens, right? Attention, right? Without that attention, communion is broken, and then you have a problem. And that's what these emotions want. These negative emotions, they want you to just give them every aspect of attention. So, for instance, getting into the good use of emotions, because God did give us emotions for a reason, right? Anger, right? Why do we have anger? Well, anger, when it's in the purpose of, that's right, I could use the wand, let's see. The angel, right? So anger in the right use means something is wrong, right? In Ephesians 4, right, it says, be angry and do not sin, right? Do not let the sun go down your wrath. So anger is given to us to give us, the fathers teach us to fight against the demons and to fight against our sin. That's why God gave us, endowed us with the movement of anger as an emotion. That's its purpose, right? But anger, when it's inverted to the demonic, becomes rage, malice, indiscriminate violence, right? Proverbs 29 says, a fool gives full vent to his spirit, right? But a wise man quietly holds it back. How do you become wise? Well, the beginning of wisdom is the fear of the Lord. So if you want to learn how to have wisdom, you got to fear God. And if you want to learn to fear God, right, you got to learn to really not give full vent to your anger. Why? Because that anger is like a demon that wants to rule you. Sadness, right? Sadness is a loss of something. We feel sadness. That was given to us to help us discern when we've lost something precious to us, right? 2 Corinthians. Godly sorrow brings repentance that leads to salvation without regret, but worldly sorrow brings death, right? Sadness, when it's inverted, becomes depression. And depression, if unchecked, becomes despair, which is a collapsing in on oneself, right? In Jeremiah, it says, the heart is deceitful above all things and desperately sick. Who can understand it? So we're seeing that because of the fall and because of all the results of the fall, our faculties, our emotions are all mixed up. And they're all mixed up because we're out of order, right? Instead of the spirit leading the soul, which leads the body, it's all inverted, and the body leads everything into sin, right? So one of the ways, I'll just say this, one of the ways, especially for you young men, if you're struggling with, let's say, lust, for instance, it's good to have certain practices. Fasting absolutely is like our first line defense. Prostrations are absolutely helpful. But unless you start dealing with certain emotions, you're just going to keep fighting with that demon. I'm telling you from experience, right? Those who I see who, who make progress and eventually get out of that struggle, they have to deal with what's going on with them emotionally. I'm not just talking like psychologically, like the thoughts, but their emotions and how they're processing feelings inside of them. It's absolutely necessary. And this is what I was talking about. People will get frustrated because they'll read, just read this, Father, just do this, just do that, just, pray. And their understanding of praying is sometimes like a magic incantation. And they end up getting frustrated. And the thing is you can't leave off these other things like Father Seraphim Rose was saying, and you have to be really careful. Because if you don't, I've been using this analogy a lot lately, but it's this example from the scripture, but it's pertinent. Do you guys know the story of Naaman? Yeah. Naaman? Anybody know what I'm talking about? Naaman was a Syrian soldier who had leprosy, and he heard of a prophet, Elijah, who was healing people who, had leprosy. So he goes and he asks to be healed. And the prophet says to him, yeah, go bathe in the Jordan 3 times and you'll be healed. Well, he's offended by that. And he's like, the Jordan? Did I come all the way from Syria to go bathe in that mud hole, the Jordan? All the great rivers we have in Syria? And his servant says, Master, if he had told you to go conquer 1,000,000 armies, you would have done it, right? But that was beneath him, right? You can't you can't run if you don't know how to walk. And learning how to deal with your emotional state on things is really what you need to do before you try to start tackling some, quote unquote, deep spiritual things, So let's talk about the passions real quick. So passions, this is from Philotheos of Sinai. This is a definition from him. Passion in the strict sense, they define as that which lurks impassionately in the soul over a long period, okay? There's a couple of things I want to point out here. Passions, all passions are sins, but not all sins are passions. You guys got that? You guys understand that? Real important to understand it because in our tradition, yes, we deal with sin, but we're mostly concerned about passions. Because passions are the thing that are habitual, that move us, okay? So passions are caused by the turning from various faculties of the soul and body away from God and directing them towards sensible reality to seek pleasure in them. So in essence, like I forget God and all I can think about is how great this bubbly, salty water is going to be, right? We experience passions and through emotions, but not all emotions are passions. So this is the thing about, remember I was talking about defining terms, right? We experience our passions as and through emotions, right? But not all the emotions are passions. And so this is important because the passions, they operate in us oftentimes without our awareness. Let me give you an example. Father John may be angry, but he's not a man who struggles with the passion of anger. Do you see the difference there? Something happens and he has a moment of anger, right? Whereas, Father Jimmy hasn't dealt with his passion, like he's just known for being an angry dude, right? And it's like, Father Jimmy overhears a couple of people talking, like, man, I don't really want to talk to Father Jimmy because I feel like every time I talk to him, he's going to bite my head off. And he's like, what? What do you mean I'm going to bite your head off? Father Jimmy, right? And Father Jimmy doesn't realize that he's being angry because it's his passion. You see, the thing about passions are that they will often work without you even realizing it, because you become passive to that movement, right? It's no longer Derek. It's now gluttony that's operating. I ate a whole pizza. I didn't even know. You know, it's like the Jekyll and Hyde thing, okay? But this is experienced primarily in the faculty of our emotions. Our emotions, okay? So the fathers break down these two divisions, like there's natural passions and unnatural passions, right? So natural passions, there's points. They depend on nature and not on the will, right? So for instance, appetite for food, fear of being harmed, and sexual attraction, those are all natural passions, or what the fathers call blameless passions. It's just part of our biological makeup, right? And the way we distinguish them is that they're necessary to preserve our nature, right? And it's not a problem unless they go beyond the need for self-preservation. So when they go beyond the need of self-preservation, it's like you can start seeing now where they begin to move into this realm, right, of the unnatural passions, right? So these are our natural passions that we have mistakenly connect with our longing for spiritual wholeness, right? So that person who has a problem with lust, it's beyond just the faculty for reproduction. It goes into an idolatry. It goes into this pursuit for sexual expression is the only way that I'm going to feel okay. It eclipses my ability to experience God. The only way I feel okay is when I'm engaged in this passion with my lust. Do you see? Okay? So it's taken something that's blameless in that sense, and now it's perverted it. It's turned it into an idol. Okay? When man isn't focused on distinguishing, this is St. Maximus, when man isn't focused on distinguishing between what is spiritual and the things of the senses, he disobeys the divine command. He errs when the irrationality of feeling is the only form of discernment. He is captured by pleasure and avoidance of pain. This is a very famous thing with St. Maximus. There's a loop that happens. I don't want to feel pain, so I'll chase pleasure. But that chasing of pleasure brings me pain. And so you see this loop. And this is what happens again. I just bring it up because a lot of people are familiar with it. But this is gluttony and this is lust. You eat too much, you don't feel good. I'll never do that again. Or you drink too much, I don't feel good. And then you feel bad, and then try to avoid it. You go to the thing that makes you feel better. Do you see what I'm saying? And that loop is only really broken when you begin to address that movement of why you're feeling bad in the first place. So what are feelings? Okay, now this is the defining terms, and this is where I'm taking some liberty here to get a point across. But I would give you this definition of feelings. They're influenced by our emotions, but they're generated from our mental thoughts. They're the interpretation of the raw data of our emotions. So follow me on this. God gave us the faculty of emotions. Are you following me? And those emotions, when they're properly subjugated to God, right, through our free will, they serve a good purpose. Holy angels, right? But the problem is we begin to interject our will through what we would call feelings. And so understanding the difference between emotions and feelings is this. Okay, you're walking into your house, and your roommate, Jimmy, jumps out with a Michael Myers mask and goes, "Oh, I'm gonna kill you!" Right? And you go, "Oh," you're scared, right? It's okay for you to be scared. But then when you go, "You," and then you like flip the table, and you run to the kitchen, you grab a bottle, and you smash Jimmy across the face, and you just start beating on him. "I'm gonna destroy you and your mother, Jimmy." That, right? That is what happens because, see, the feelings, right? The feelings are where you've gone from, it's a natural thing for anyone to be scared. But because of your pride, "How dare you scare me in my own home, Jimmy? I'm going to ruin you and your whole bloodline." That movement, that's That's the feelings. You're now taking your will and interpreting the raw. You can't help the raw data of your emotions, but your will, which is your vanity, all those things are now feeding you into something else. Are you following me? Right? And if this is the thing, this is why I'm working really hard with my 11-year-old son, because he's got that thing. So I want him to learn to really not have to like get wild on his buddy for calling him a coward now, because when he's 18, it's a whole different story, right? So translation, right? Defining terms and trying to translate this also into our tradition, right? Because I'm probably failing at it, but I'm hoping that you'll come out understanding that our tradition has the tools to help us deal with these things, but you have to kind of see them in a different way to really use them, right? So all thoughts don't originate with us, right? And this is the opportunity where I want to start talking about logismi, right? Because when you understand that one of the biggest problems with feelings, meaning I have this emotion and Bob was cheating on me, I know it, right? That's one thing, but sometimes if you learn to always trust your feelings, which then will, emotions will produce feelings, right? And those thoughts, you begin to listen to those thoughts all the time, you become very susceptible for what we call logismi, which are these assaultive, intrusive thoughts, which are not always, they're not from you, all right? They're not from you. So what are logismi? Okay, this is pulling roughly from Maximus, right? So images together, right, with thoughts, right? Images together with thoughts. So I'll just go through and I'll explain it. All things have their inner principle, he calls this the logoi, at which they speak and communicate with man, right? I'm looking at gold. I'm looking at the figure of a woman. I'm looking at a buffalo, okay? And so some of these thoughts are simple, right? But sometimes they are composite, or there's like multiple things put together, and that complication brings problems. Don't worry, I'm getting somewhere with this. So thoughts aren't linked with passions, are simple. Whereas passion-charged thoughts are composite, and these are what the fathers are speaking of when they talk about logismi. So for instance, gold, woman, man, right? It's a simple thought, right? But when I now have an association, I see gold, I see power and control over people through wealth. You see? When I see a woman, instead of being like, oh, woman, right? I think, gratification, object, people will think I'm the man when I have her on my arm. Do you see what I'm saying? That now is charged with your passions, right? So your passion, if you have an inclination towards lust, right? When you look at a man, instead of just seeing like the guy working on the construction site, you see something that moves you to a state that you don't want, right? The more that happens, the more that movement inside you is generated, what begins to happen is, even when you aren't willingly doing that, right, you'll get suggestions for those things. And when you get suggestions for those things, even though you don't want them, then they get worse. They get worse, right? And again, I just keep using it, forgive me, but it's a very applicable aspect. This is why lust is so bad, right? Because it just gets worse, right? It never just starts off with like the real simple basic thing. It gets worse and darker and darker. Do you understand what I'm saying? So this reality, right, is one where you're not just dealing with your own passions, your own desires, but now you've kind of like smeared yourself with honey and you're running around in the anthill thinking nothing's going to touch you. Well, of course you're going to attract insects and bugs because you've smeared yourself, right? And this is why learning to deal with your emotions is a little bit of a hack of learning to deal with your passions. And learning to deal with your passions is one of the ways that you keep the devils off your back. Because fundamentally, the devils can't make you do anything. But when you walk around smearing yourself with honey and just saying, I'm not tasty, I'm not sweet, it's like, well, yeah. No wonder you're having these problems, right? With thoughts, okay? So if you understand these logisme, these assaultive thoughts, they aren't living and sentient like you and I are, but they're living like, when St. Paul talks about the fiery arrows of the enemy, you know how we would say fire is living, right? It's not like fire is going to do math or fire is going to talk to you about theology, but fire will have a mind of its own, right? You like add oxygen, right? It's the same thing with these logisme. It's like the more data or the more oxygen you put in, then they're going to take a life of their own. And this is where intrusive thoughts really begin. And people who struggle with them, one of the problems with what the church says versus what a lot of, there's overlap, but this is one of the distinctions oftentimes, depending on the modality of what psychologists will say about dealing with thoughts, right? Some of the things that psychologists will give people to deal with thoughts can actually make the problem worse, because they're not looking at the source of the thought for what it is. So in other words, some people will have intrusive thoughts, and they're having intrusive thoughts because they have fomented sin in their life. Are you following me? So now that sin is it's attracting things to them. But a psychologist may not even see that thing as a sin and say like, oh, that's okay that you do that, Jimmy. And it's like, Jimmy's doing it more and more, thinking it's not a problem. And the next thing you know, Jimmy's just riddled with these issues. I'm going to go through this kind of real quick because I'm probably sure I'm running out of time. I'm really long-winded. But understand this thing about feelings, they can lead to real problems. And I'll just say this key one here is really good, Cain and Abel, right? Cain is a perfect example of feelings making problems, because God speaks to Cain about his offering. Are you following me? And Cain's interpretation of God's statement to him, or God's movement towards him, was incorrect, and it caused him to what? To murder his brother. Remember, God says to him, sin is crouching at your door, it seeks to master you. You must master over it. Okay. When you read that, you need to see yourself as Cain and see when it says sin is crouching at your door, it seeks to rule over you, but you must master it. Instead of Cain, put in, Paul. And instead of sin, put in feelings, right? And crouching at your door, put that here, your heart. It's crouching at your door. It's waiting to influence you, right? Because that emotive faculty, it isn't coming from here. It's coming from here. You can't help it. But the problem is once it starts here, right, the feelings come in. It's like, ooh, what is this, right? I'm never wrong. I'm always right. So I have to interpret this feeling in a way that's going to make me look good, right? And if that doesn't happen, then I need to do everything I can to make myself look good, which means kill my brother. Do you see how that works? Right? It's one of the reasons why vanity and vainglory is so dangerous. Because these movements, right, they can cause us to become someone we never intended to be. Here's a little bit of a formula for you. So if you understand that emotions become feelings, so this is all immaterial, meaning like you have this movement of emotions, right? So I'm scared. That's a natural passion. It's like, okay, there's nothing wrong with you being scared, right? But that feeling, which is my interpretation of that emotion, that will become a behavior. If I don't check that, and every time something makes me like uncomfortable, right, I start developing what people will commonly say anxiety. And now I'm making a home for anxiety. I'm living in anxiety because it's become a behavior. That is my response to something that I'm not comfortable with. You following me? So instead of actually trying to find out why I'm uncomfortable with it, what part of me hasn't been developed, what muscle hasn't been developed in me to deal with why I'm uncomfortable, I just give in to that feeling because I interpret it as like, well, obviously something shouldn't be the way it is, and I need to do everything I can to feel better, right? you now start operating in anxiety, right? So now that immaterial movement becomes material. It's now affecting your body. Whatever it is, you get IBS, you start sweating, you need to eat to make the anxiety go away, you need to yell at someone, you need to drink, whatever it is. That behavior is now moved into the material realm, right? It's affecting your body. And those behaviors become habits. And those habits are another word we call addiction. Because a habit is something that is now anchored in your soul through your body. This is why sometimes, I'm just telling you, because this is one of my degrees, right? Not that that matters, because experience is more important than a degree. People in our context, in the church, they'll go to well-meaning priests, well-meaning godparents, well-meaning people and say, I'm having this problem. And the well-meaning minister, whoever it is, godparent, priest, will just try to give them immaterial solutions for a material problem. Do you guys understand what I'm saying? People, this happens a lot. You just need to pray more. I can't stop looking at porn. You just need to pray it away. No. That won't work. Because there's these other things that have to be dealt with because you can't even enter into prayer. You're just saying words. Listen, guys, forgive me. Forgive me, Father. Forgive me. If you're mouthing words, but this and this is thinking about something else, it's not prayer. And the Father's called an abomination unto the Lord. It is better for you to sit down and cry some tears and say, man, God, I'm a wretch, help me, than it is to be like, oh, I'm just going to read this prayer. And like, that's not the thing. So this anchoring in the material, right, you need to deal with that. You need to deal with it. And you deal with it primarily through getting in this area of the emotions, right? These habits, these become passions. These habits become passions. And I'll say to you, this is also where people begin to pass on their sin to their kids. Because sin is not to be understood as a moral infraction. I did this thing and I sinned. Yes, that's true. But we, in the patristic understand sin as disease. It's a disease. And when you understand it, as the fathers understand it, then it begins to make a lot more sense. And you begin to understand that Orthodoxy is about healing. And remember, there's these portions in there in the earlier part of the slide about healing being for the whole man. Healing cannot just be about your intellectual faculty of like, hey, tell me something that makes me feel like I'm smart and good and I'm okay. That doesn't heal you. Because you need to be healed in the place of the heart and in the place of the body as well. That's why penances, right, will often have things like prostrations, fasting, other things to help integrate the whole body with the mind and the heart, okay? So I'll go with this. Anyways, this kind of translation, right, I wanted to do this so we have this understanding so that this doesn't stay relegated in kind of over here. That's an interesting topic with some theories. But rather, my big concern is that we're transformed. Like we're actually finding the healing that Christ wants for us. That is why we have sacraments and why we have prayer. That's the purpose of the sacraments and the liturgical life of the church, right? Remember, the Sabbath was made for man, not the man for Sabbath, right? So if you understand loosely, right, this isn't for you to write a thesis on. This is for you to learn how to pray, to confess, and to be healed, okay? If you think of Logos Me, and you see Logos Me, reading Logos Me, if you understand that kind of in the realm of your feelings, and you understand your passions in the realm of emotions, then as you do encounter prayer and you're reading some patristic things, I'm hoping this will help you to actually have, with the help of Father, applied theology to where it's actually doing what's supposed to do, which is to help you change with the help of Christ and not just be like, I know stuff, okay? So how do we do this? Let me give you some real quick application. Adam gave name to all the cattle, to all the birds of the air, and to every beast of the field. Okay? Part of our vocation as children of Adam is to bring into order the things that surround and involve our lives, which includes our inner life. By properly identifying what's happening within us, we fulfill this vocation. So Adam was given the call, the vocation to name all the animals, right? So we should understand that as like reality, the world we're living in, right? This also includes like, this is your universe right here. Every human being is a universe. Everybody has an inner life that's vast within them. Is everybody following me? Right? Well, one of the first things about being in the garden, right? Here's paradise. Right? Here's paradise. Something's guarding the way to paradise. Is anybody following me? Are you understanding? Right? The way to do this, you have to start taking into account and bringing order to the garden. Right? Let me tell you about my dog, Tober. Not Bane. Bane's the one I have now. But Tober was a dog that I had, which is, he was half German Shepherd, half Doberman, half Husky, if you can imagine that. If you've ever seen that, you can look it up. They look like German Shepherds when they put together. But I am originally from Southern California, a place called Orange County, right? So, pretty middle class place, sunny Southern California, okay? Let me ask you a question. Do you guys know what a husky is? Does everybody know what a husky is? Okay, what are huskies bred to do? Be in the snow and pull sleds, right? Okay. What are Dobermans bred to do? Do you know? They're guard dogs. That's what they're bred to do, okay? So I got Tober from my pool man, Gil. Gil had a husky and he had a Doberman, and they had puppies, okay? So I lived in sunny Southern California where there was no snow and there's no sled, and I lived in a good neighborhood so where there wasn't need for a watchdog. So although Tober was a beautiful dog, Tober had some problems because Tober liked to chew. And believe it or not, Tober chewed on the aluminum patio furniture. Tober started to chew on brick. And when Tober started to chew on the wooden support beam for the awning of the patio, my dad's like, Tober's got to go, right? Because all of the training wasn't doing anything, right? But what was the problem? The problem was that inside of Tober were these things to pull a sled and to work and to guard, and he had no real work to fit what was going on inside of him. You see what I'm saying? So he acted out. And I'm not a dog whisperer. My dad wasn't a dog whisperer, so it was like we got rid of Tober. The point of this story is it's the same thing. You have to discover those natural inclinations, the good ones, of vocation within you. When you begin to do the things that we're all called to do, you start to bring order into your life. That's repentance on an Adamic level, right? So starting to name these things is part of the process. If you name it, so you can tame it, okay? Just for the fun, because everyone might be sleepy, let me just throw in a little bit of demonology in here for you. It's a common kind of like thing, but there is truth to it. It's not advisable, so don't anybody go do this, but it is a thing about the name of a demon and having some authority over it. It's in the scriptures and it's real. That's a thing, right? But you don't have to go there to understand what I'm saying. You know, it's a sad fact, but there was a time in certain parts of the world that they wouldn't name a child up until they were 4 years old. Do you know why? Does anybody know why that would happen? Because mortality rates were so high at that time. So it was not uncommon, unfortunately, for a child not to make it to 4 years old. So they would sometimes, 4 months. I say 4 years old. 4 months old. Forgive me. 4 months old. So they would hold off the naming of a child. Because once you name something, once you know the name of something, there's a connection to it, right? Because there's power in the name, right? So there's this understanding about naming something, right? So when I was running trauma therapy groups for people who have had generational trauma and complex trauma, complex PTSD, one of the first things that I would do is, as a case manager, meaning I'm helping them in their practical life, one of the first things I would do is give them a sense of like order, right? Cleaning their room, finding, some sort of like rhythm of getting up. That's one of the first things I would do to help them kind of transition into health. And then from there, when they're in the actual like therapy session, getting them to now start developing what we call is emotional intelligence. Emotional intelligence. So you have these basic emotions, anger, and anticipation, joy, trust, right? And when you're able to move someone out of that space of like, I'm just mad, right? The problem is that there's lots of variance in that. And that nuance is necessary to engage properly. When people have bad emotional regulation, you ever known someone who, if like there's one like an amp, right? Like a guitar amp, 1 to 11, right? Or 1 to 10, right? And you ever known someone who like they tend to come in on something at an 8 when it should be a 3? Do you know what I'm talking about? Like some people are just so intense. It's like, hey, Mark, I think you're working with somebody, you're a server, and like, hey, Mark, I think there's a spill on at table 6. Like that guy who just everything is turned up, right? That is someone with some broken emotional regulation, obviously. And part of what needs to happen for them is you got to teach Mark nuance. Mark has to learn that, a spilt glass of milk at table 4 is not the same response as someone, you're walking outside and someone's bashing your car in with a crowbar. But see, Mark, because of various reasons, responds that way, right? So one of the things I have to teach him is being able to name certain things like, okay, Mark, maybe you're just annoyed at Beth, right? And being annoyed is okay where you're at right now. But what I need you to learn is you need to learn to be able to say like, okay, I'm annoyed. I'm not in rage because Beth told me to, turn down the TV. You see what I'm saying? Getting Mark to start to name and have some distinction in his feelings is now him starting to engage and fulfill his Adamic work of what's going on inside of him, naming the animals, right? And by naming the animals, he begins to have authority. And that authority is part of where he begins to walk into that place where he can receive grace from God. Is anybody following me, right? This is a very applicable thing because this is something that you can do. You can begin to understand like, okay, if I have problems with, emotions and me being able to really understand like, okay, what am I actually experiencing? Because remember, part of the big problem is the feelings, or another word is how you're interpreting what the emotion is. But you're probably interpreting the emotion wrongly, right? So it's not about necessarily getting rid of having no emotions. Like there's this word the fathers use called dispassion. A person who's dispassionate is not walking along like this. Oh, that person's dead. Oh, the house is on fire. Oh, Lord have mercy. That's not dispassion. That person's sick. You know what I mean? Dispassion is about not being moved one way or the other, right? Dispassion is about being able to interpret something consistently in a godlike manner. A person who has dispassion weeps at tragedy, rightly. A person who has dispassion will feel godly anger at something, but he won't be moved into rage, into vengeance. He won't be moved into despair. Sophrony had deep feeling and experiences, but he wasn't moved by those things into a passion, into hatred, into rage, into, revenge, these things. So the way to do it is to remember, okay, I've got right, these things are here for a reason, right? What is God trying to tell me with this experience I'm having, right? And then on the end of it is this devil anger has always been telling me to kill my enemy. He's always telling me that. Maybe there's something else I should be hearing, you see. Another way to understand is the prodigal son, right? So emotional maturity is the process of returning our emotions to the original intention of the Heavenly Father, right? So this is essentially the core thing is you're not trying to get rid of your emotions, right? You're trying to get them to the place where they are serving their purpose, which is bringing you to this place of being in this world and experiencing life as God had intended it. Because emotions are a necessary part of our being. But because of the fall, and because of the division that the fall brought, because of all the things that affect us, we can't really oftentimes trust our emotional state. And so we have to learn through the life of the church, right? And the life of the church isn't just abstract reading. It's in repentance. It's in learning humility. This is why almsgiving is so important. It's one of the things I don't really hear much about in circles of in Lenten circles. It's like almsgiving is one of the most underused and most powerful tools that the church has. Because when you learn to give alms, you learn to come outside of yourself. And it breaks avarice, it breaks gluttony, it breaks egoism, it breaks self-love. Almsgiving is a very, very powerful ascetic endeavor, and it can really help you to master yourself. Because alms is sometimes, but here's the trick. It has to sting. I think this is why alms doesn't work for a lot of people, because they think, yeah, I gave $5 to that guy. $5 don't mean anything to you. You spent more at Starbucks than you did what you gave that guy. The medicine of alms begins to work when it stings. That's when you'll start to see the process actually being effectual in your life. Okay. I think that's good for the most part. We can get into all this, but I'm probably way over time. I do want to identify this because this is powerful right here. There's these things here which I think these are key. These are really helpful. One of these things about identifying emotions is there's these things which are really hard for us. One of the first things is shame. Everyone has heard this thing about toxic shame, right? Maybe, maybe not. But there's an idea going around that shame is bad. So I'll make the distinction of there is, let's say, a toxic shame, and that's a shame that reinforces your self-centeredness for sure. But shame is actually given to us to help us find the deep place of our heart, to find where something's wrong. There's this thing, I might butcher it, it's called, do I have any nurses or EMTs or anything in the room? No? Or, so am I gonna butcher, crepsis or crepitus? Crepsis? Crepitus. Crepitus is when you hear that bone on bone, right? Okay. So if I'm driving and there's a terrible accident on the side of the road and I get out and I'm like, oh my gosh, and there's a young man there and I don't see any blood, there's no missing limbs, but he's kind of sitting there and he's kind of holding his arm a little bit, not really sure. And I'm not an EMT, but I'm just saying, you begin to kind of examine him. He's like, oh, okay, whatever. But then you touch his arm, that crepitus happens. What does that tell you? You can't see the wound per se, but there's some information that gets communicated to you that there is a problem. Are you following me? This is what shame is. And so a lot of people haven't learned that if you want to, one of the key things to have an actual good confession, this is kind of part the other talk, to find the deep heart is actually learning to embrace shame. Because watch this, people, if you confess, I've seen this a lot, where people get really good, they learn terms, vainglory, gluttony. They learn these things. They can sit there and go like, I have vainglory, I have gluttony, and they just they rattle off a thing. It's great. But you can actually hide behind that. There's a big difference between I had lust versus I did da 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 da. You know why you can say, yeah, I confessed I had lust versus I did da 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 da. The reason why you don't want to confess I did da 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 is because of the shame that's involved. Now, there's a whole thing, and generally, like for me, this is just me, but I teach my people, my spiritual children, that they need to learn to confess in as much as they don't want to confess, meaning the shame is telling them like, okay, right? The priest doesn't need the gory details. You don't need to write him. It's not a steamy romance novel. You don't give the narrative like a foggy night and then da-da. That's not, like the priest doesn't want that. You know what I'm saying? And in fact, that can lead into sin, right? You don't want that. But you do oftentimes need to go just beyond I had lust, because you're just hiding behind the generality of like, oh, of course I have sin. Everybody has sin. But when you get into that place of like, I don't want to say this to Father, right? Or even better yet, you don't want to say that to Father. Did you see what I just did there? Did anybody catch what just happened right there? There's a difference between I don't really want to say this to Father versus, oh, you shouldn't say that to Father. Do you see the difference? There's a little freebie, okay? Right? If you can learn to discern between those two things, it'll be very helpful for you. It'll be very helpful for Father. Because when you're dealing with you, shouldn't do it, don't say that to Father, or look what you did. Because there's also a difference between accusation and shame. Don't feed accusation, but turn to your shame. Shame is, yes, I did this. I did this. And I know by that crepitus, I know by that pain that I'm feeling, it is a real offense that has wounded me and wounded my brother and wounded God. Are you seeing? And so going there just enough, with just enough detail to where you can feel the shame lifted. And that's how you'll know it, because when you go there, it's like, whew, it's like the door opens and then the Spirit's like, okay. But the other side of it, of indulging accusation, this is where people will go into confession and come out heavier. Because they haven't confessed actual sin, they've confessed the accusation, the logos me, the devil has told them. Don't you know you're a terrible person? Don't you know because the way you talk to her, like, you see what I'm saying? And that, when you believe that accusation, because Satan means accuser. Now you're doing the work of the devil for him. So don't do that. That's not what I'm talking about when I say shame. Because that leads into this next point here about learning to take ownership over your reality. That's one of the ways you can discern the two also. Because when you embrace that shame, now you're being brought into this place of repentance on an Adamic level again. Because Adam's sin was he abdicated his responsibility. Adam, he began to blame Eve for what really was his problem. He abdicated his responsibility. When he says, it was the woman that you gave me. Right? Instead of saying, yes, I was not caring for my wife. I was not tending her like I should have. And because I wasn't tending my wife, I've also offended you, God, because I wasn't being a steward for the responsibility you gave me. This is the sin of Adam. So when we don't take responsibility for our inner life, we're falling into the sin of Adam again, right? So the other thing I would add, this is helpful too, is one of the ways of dealing and trying to get your emotions back to where they need to be. This is for those of you who especially deal with anxiety, is a little tip for you too, is you need to learn to, instead of feeling like saying I'm anxious every time that uncomfortable movement happens, you need to learn to try to turn that into curiosity. As a confessor, I'm not trying to destroy your passions, except for envy. Envy is the only one we have to stamp it out. Because the passions are like these natural movements that have become unnatural. So as a confessor, I'm trying to help transfigure them, right? So trying to get that fallen angel to, become what it should have been, which is a good angel, and communicate proper messages, right? So that unsurety, which has become nurtured and it becomes anxiety, if you can learn to turn that into curiosity and anticipation, that begins to empower you to deal with the situations that you find yourself in. Because a big part of that anxiety is fundamentally a fear of the future. And that fear of the future comes from feeling powerlessness, right? And that powerlessness is what begins to, you have to find some way to address it and to acknowledge it, so you begin to feel it in your body and it's your thoughts, all that stuff. So taking responsibility by saying, okay, well, what can this mean? That also builds faith, because that anticipation, that curiosity, now opens a door for saying, what can you do, God? What will you do, God? What can you empower me to do, God? Right? Because despair is a cheap fix. Giving into despair is easy. It's like, well, I know how this ends. And even though that doesn't feel good, you're still in control, because at least you know it's going to happen. But that's its own kind of lie. So dealing with anxiety is dealt with primarily with learning to turn those feelings into curiosity. So finally, of course, love. Love is the bridle and the cure for emotions, right? Love bears with all things, patiently accepts all things, and love never fails. This phrase, never fails, makes it clear that unless they have been granted total deliverance from the passions through the most complete and active love of the Spirit, even those who have received spiritual gifts are still liable to falter. They are still in danger and must struggle in fear against the attacks launched on them by the spirits of evil. St. Paul shows that not to be in danger of falling or liable to passions is such a lofty state that the tongues of angels, prophecy, all knowledge, and gifts of healing are as nothing compared to it. That's St. Simeon Metaphates. And it's true, because when you have love, and I don't mean like I like something, like, oh, I love me some wings. I don't mean it like that. But true love in the Christian, sense, it really does begin to guide, heal, and put in order all of our right movements. That's like the hack, if you will. But you have to understand it in the right sense, because one of the key things to understand, if you don't know what love is, there's one word that you should always just learn to plug in. It's like, I don't know how to find love in the situation. If you really don't know how to find love, then you need to find out where you need to sacrifice. That's the way to discern if something is actual love or not. Because without that sacrifice, that love will most likely turn into idolatry. Thus within the church, we struggle to transform all emotions as well as everything mundane. The transformation of emotions to genuine and authentic experience is accomplished by repentance. Repentance leads us from a painful and tragic monologue to a dialogue with the living God. Through repentance, self-condemnation, and humility, we transform emotions to spiritual experiences. And this case also holds true when we mentioned about fantasy. The more a person is emotionally ill, the more he reveals the depth and darkness of his nous. And the more a person's emotions are transformed, the more his nous is illumined. He is at the state of illumination. This is Metropolitan Hedatheos, right? So, 3 things. Prayer purifies the mind and trains the soul. But again, that prayer isn't just rattling off empty words. It's actually having to use attention and humility, right? I would say this to you, it may sound odd to you, but again, you'll be more likely to be in a place of prayer by sitting down quietly and just being honest with God and saying, I did this, versus trying to check a box, right? Not that we shouldn't have prayer rules, not that we shouldn't use prayer books, that's not what I'm saying. But prayer in this context of purifying the mind is what I'm talking about. Because there's the prayer that we offer to God that is our good requirement and obligation as Christians, which we should do. This is our prayer rules and services. But the prayer that purifies the mind is a prayer that reaches for pain of heart. Without that pain of heart, in this context I'm talking about, you haven't prayed. And that's another hack for you. If you you do your prayers and you're like, okay, I said my prayers. But if you're wanting to pray and you're really wanting to connect with God, one of the ways that you will know, how will I know if I'm going to walk away from this time of prayer, quote unquote, satisfied or not? Did you have pain of heart? If you had pain of heart, those of you who know what I'm talking about, you know that you can have 3 minutes of prayer and walk away just feeling like you prayed all day, versus how many times have you said your hour-long half prayer rule with 4 akathis and everything, you just feel like you just sat there because you didn't have any pain of heart. That pain of heart is what taps you into that place where the living God is. Third thing, fasting is a means towards self-control and balance of the whole person. So when I say fasting here, I don't necessarily just mean the obvious church fast of not eating meat and dairy, but more importantly, in this case, your emotions, it's maybe you should be fasting from, the media that you are taking in. If you notice that you're taking in something and it's fomenting certain movements in you, it's like music. Certain music, you listen to it and it invokes sadness and invokes anger and you like it. My daughter, my 14-year-old daughter, she was going through this kind of emo phase, whatever. And I was like, I'm not going to do that, And I had to talk to her because I was like, the problem isn't that, because if you want some music that, that's one of the powerful things about Great Lent, right? It's there's these mournful movements which are great and they move you to a place of prayer. But what she was listening to, Bright Eyes and all that stuff, I'm like, this is just fomenting the kind of self-pity, kind of you know what I'm talking about. People like to sit in that, It's like the kid that doesn't want to change his diaper. He'd rather sit in his poopy diaper because it's comfortable. I know, but this is real. It's I got kids. I'm telling you, dude, don't you want me to change your diaper? No. It's okay, right? And if you think about depression, this is oftentimes what depression is. We'd rather sit in our poopy diaper. Cold, slimy, just ugh. But I don't want to feel the discomfort of what it means to be changed. You see? And this is why people get stuck in that loop of depression. So fasting from certain things, like music that invokes that, will help you. It's these people who are I'm anxious. But I'm yeah, but look what you're doing. Look what you're watching. You're consuming, all the latest, greatest, news. And it's of course you don't feel like there's any hope because you're just watching the news all the time. And the news is not there to tell you how to live your life. The news is there to get you scared because that's how they get money, right? That's how they keep viewings. So fasting from things that are causing these problems, right? And lastly, confession is the means by which a person's wounds are revealed and by which both prayer and asceticism are prescribed. So in confession, through these things that we talked about, like shame and these other things which are tough for us, we begin to open the wound to the doctor. And then from there, we're able to actually have our fasting and our prayers actually do something for us besides making us feel look how holy and spiritual I am, Because you're not, and who cares? We really want to be healed. We don't want to have a false idea of what we're doing. We want to actually be healed, I would like to think. So, okay, I think that's it. Yeah, that's it.
Okay, so if people have questions, oh, we have a break first? Oh.